going a little bit into this Buddhism beliefs and spirituality, what is your understanding of so-called karma?
For me personally, I think is something that is very unique in my own mind. One of my favorite sayings of the Buddha is, everything I tell you is pure gold that is potentially true. I often say in my lectures as well. I think this is a very nice sentence because people have to find out for themselves. You know, so for me, this metaphysical, or however you want to call it, this kind of understanding, I have no interest to pass that on to other people because they need to find out for themselves. They can find out what they want, whether there's like a total end or whether people go on. Honestly, what I would prefer the most is if everybody would get what they want to get. That would be the nicest scenario. So people who believe in nothing get nothing. People who believe in maybe some Humpty-Dumpty hell, they go to hell. And people who like have other thoughts, maybe this then happens. I think that would be the funniest scenario I can think of. Just everybody gets what they expect.
Do you have some kind of spiritual practice, so to say, or how do you integrate your academic career and your, let's say, spiritual being?
I practiced meditation a long time. I think meditation doesn't need to be spiritual. I think there can be parts of it because it's very diverse. It's a really huge array of like all sorts of knowledge and teachers and schools of thinking and so on that you have about it. And for me, it's important. I'm a method person. I want to try things out. So I try different flavors. I go different directions. And now I have my tool set of things that I can use when I'm in a specific situation, just want to relax a little bit. When I know that I need to be really aware and attentive to people's emotions. And then it's helpful sometimes in between to have these 5 minutes beforehand, you know, so it's a credit to Abraham Lincoln, who knows if he ever said that, but if I need to chop down a tree and I have 3 hours, I take 1 hour to sharpen the axe. I don't know if I got the numbers right. And I feel the mind for me works pretty much like that. But then there's the other element of like, how does this really square with science? And there I gotta say, I think what meditation can show you, it can give you an idea of non-permanence. And that for a long time was a struggle with my scientific existence because you see Western science is very much orientated towards illusion of objectivity and with that also permanence. And that for me, deep down, didn't make any sense. Then I learned about some Indian philosophers who are dead long time, but who are great, who I really like. I want to name Dharmakirti. I like Kant. People is getting a lot of backlash right now, but I prefer Indian reason. Dharmakirti is, I think, much better approach to reason. Kant is still great, but rightly so, because of colonialism, because of other things that came out of that, there is a backlash against Kant. Reason, as it's written by Dharmakirti, is actually working better for this non-permanence. Because this is another problem with Kant, among the many problems that you can name there. The other thing is critical realism. There is Roy Bhaskar, and the strong understanding how objectivity and subjectivity can be squared. And out of that, and I think this harmonizes pretty nicely with some Buddhist thinkers, there can be objective truth. They are maybe in logic, maybe in ethics. And then there can be empirical realities, and they are always piecemeal. They are always partial realities. And I think that's fine. I think it's part of our human existence that we only always understand parts. You know, and then maybe as a whole, maybe as a society, we can move past that. Maybe we can have a bigger understanding on how we ought to act. And I think this is the step that we now need to take to grow up as humankind. I think this is the most vital step that is in front of us, to integrate that and to step out of the 20th century finally and say, okay, there are things that we agree upon, but we also honor that we have subjective perspectives, and that is very important.
What just comes into my mind is when you held a lecture 3-4 years ago, we were talking about what would be needed to really transform and to change life here. And I think you said, if you want to save the world by yourself, forget it. Like first, what you also said was that you practically see the most effect on, or the most hope, I don't know, in a new kind of spiritual movement or religious thing that would be coming up? Do you remember what you were saying there, or what you...
I don't know. I think not religious. I would say ethical. So I would say of like interconnectedness, like how people connect to each other. It doesn't need to be religious. I'm all in for like religious freedom. In academic circles, it's pretty big right now, bashing religions. I think it became pretty big over the last few decades. But I think the main point is that we agree that like ethics cannot come out of nowhere. They need to come somewhere, and it's an effort, you know, how people should act, what we ought to do. That is something that we need to work on, and we can only work on this together. And I think then how in the past, sometimes religious institutions were preaching that, and including Buddhism, that's why I think you have to be skeptical there as well, often wrong. And often not integrative, and often also haunted by identity belongings that are excluding, you know, that are cutting people out. So I think this is the struggle. But it's also, I think we need to be a little bit humble about our own impact. I mean, believing that we can alone achieve something big is putting a huge burden on us. And I think that's really difficult. Like, I want to change the world, but I know I contribute. As one friend of mine always put it, we are like droplets in a wave. And the wave will hit the shore. We will solve this, I have no doubt. But moving together, finding the time to connect, finding the time to talk to each other. And I think it became a little bit too accelerated. I think that's the tricky point. And then, as a friend of mine once put it, taking a step back, looking at the whole picture is now more important than ever. Because we can have everything. I mean, who is lacking anything except for all the people that don't have the privileges that we have? So that's the big gap. And how we can overcome that, how we can create more equality and justice on the planet, that's actually the challenge. So always looking at us is a bit counterintuitive, I think. And I say this from a very privileged position because, I mean, I have like permanent payment and so on. So yeah, how we can really achieve that, I think that's a big struggle. I think this is something that we need to work on, and hard. I think this a lot of thought should go into this.
And you just mentioned also colonialism.
Yeah, I currently work on a book, and I think this is a really grim picture because colonialism, in a sense, and people might disagree there now, never ended, I think. I think we really, like the economic structures that we created, the dependencies, and also the cultural narratives that we imprinted on our planet through the internet, through the media, and so on. This is really something where I'm not always 100% optimistic, because that creates the majority of the suffering that we still see in the world. And it's also problems that come back to haunt us. That's why it's so short-sighted how we act. It's undeniable that the consumerism, the individualism of the Western world is on the shoulders and with the burdening of the global South, with a lot of minorities. And I think this situation hasn't really gotten better. It just got framed into different ideologies. So people think that slavery ended, that like all these economic dependencies ended, and so on. And I think they were transformed. And we often talk about transformation, and there are many transformations that are good, but these economic transformation and the associated ecological problems and social disruptions, we really have to call it like this, because almost 99% of all communities that existed 100 years ago don't exist as they do today. And that's because of globalization. So, and that's something where our Western values basically flooded the world with all sorts of ideologies in order to maximize, well, at the end of the day, probably our profit. And that's something that we have to end now. These ideologies don't make any sense. Of course, we want to live in democracies. I want to live in a democracy at least. But a democracy cannot, I mean, this is something that we still have to work on. That's something continuous. That's something that we explore. So to say that this is a goal is, I think, again, wrong. I think a democracy is a means, and then we keep working on it. And I think we haven't been very good, I dare say. It's because these injustices, they still exist. They continue to this day. And overcoming this is, I think, the only possibility for a future. Because based on suppression, based on abusing the planet, and based on creating suffering among the majority of people, we have no future if we don't end this. So I feel this is very, very important. And it's also controversial. Probably many of the things now I said can be misunderstood. So we need to find this dialogue. We need to find this exchange. And I think this is a big struggle. It's really difficult.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Henrik,
you
for taking the time to tape this interview. And yeah, you also have a YouTube channel.
Which I should upload more videos. I'm planning on that, actually.
Awesome. So I will link it down. And I know there are some videos on, for example, how to balance your day. And if you want to check that out, you can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you a lot. Have a nice day. And hopefully see you in the next interview.
Thank you.
Ja, danke.